Well, Joe Biden, the president who some seem to think is too old to be president, flew across the Atlantic Ocean 4 times in a week. First to France to attend the ceremonies commemorating D-Day, and then back to Washington, then back across the Atlantic to Italy for the all-important G7 meeting. And then the longest leg of his flight schedule was from Europe back across the Atlantic, this time all the way across the country to Los Angeles, where on Saturday night, where when I would have been prohibitively jet-lagged to even speak, President Biden, in an appearance with his most important friend in politics, President Barack Obama, laid out the stakes in this presidential election.
Institutions matter. And this president, what he did on January the 6th, hear what he's saying now. He said if he doesn't win, there'll be a bloodbath. It's outrageous what he's talking about.
And if Donald Trump does win the Electoral College, he has promised pardons and immediate releases from prison for all of the people who violently attacked the Capitol for Donald Trump on January 6, 2021, to try to overturn the presidential election. The greatest single crime ever committed against democracy in American history now has the full and open public support of one of our presidential candidates who just happens to also be a criminal defendant accused of being the lead conspirator in that crime against American democracy leading up to and on January 6th. On Saturday night, President Biden heightened the stakes in the election by pointing out something we all should have seen as obvious before President Biden said it, which is that if Donald Trump wins the Electoral College again, he'll be in a position to immediately appoint at least 2 extreme Republican members of the Supreme Court who will be able to extend the life of the Trump court for another 40 years.
These threats to abortion rights, to women's rights, to even to birth control and IVF are not in our liberal imaginations anymore. They're very real. And these decisions, these very personal, intimate decisions are now being made by 9 unelected judges, one of whom flies his flag upside down. The other one of the others drives around in a $267,000 gift on vacations. And I think we are all wondering, what can we do about this?
Elect me. Again, I'll tell you why. No, I'm not just saying. The next president is likely to have 2 new Supreme Court nominees. 2 more. 2 more. He's already appointed 2 that have been very negative in terms of the rights of individuals. The idea that if he's reelected, he's going to appoint 2 more flying flags upside down is really, I really mean it. Could
this be the scariest part of all of it?
Well, I think it is one of the scariest parts of it. Look, the Supreme Court has never been as out of kilter as it is today. I mean, never. I taught constitutional law for 9 years. This guy knows more about it than most. Look, the fact of the matter is that this has never been a court that's been this far out of step. And by the way, when we said after the decision that overruled Roe v. Wade, the Dobbs decision, you had Clarence Thomas talking about the fact that there are going to be other things we should reconsider, including in vitro fertilization, including contraception, including all these things. And they're going. And by the way, gay rights. Marriage. But by the way, not on my watch. Not on my watch.
Here's the outline of the 2-judge deal Joe Biden was just talking about. Clarence Thomas is 75 years old. He doesn't look especially healthy. He doesn't look like he likes his job. He has already been identified as the most corrupt Supreme Court justice in history, given that no Supreme Court justice in history has ever actually been accused of a crime. Clarence Thomas violates ethical standards and financial disclosure rules at an unprecedented level that makes him the Supreme Court justice who has financially exploited his position as a Supreme Court justice more than any other justice in history, and no one else is even close. How much money would it take to get 75-year-old Clarence Thomas to resign from the Supreme Court so that Donald Trump could replace him with 43-year-old Judge Aileen Mercedes Cannon, who could serve 40 years on the United States Supreme Court after she dismisses the charges against Donald Trump in the criminal case that Jack Smith has brought against Donald Trump for violations of the Espionage Act, which Judge Cannon would absolutely do as soon as possible if Donald Trump won the Electoral College. Donald Trump wouldn't even have to ask her to do that. Clarence Thomas won't just get a brand new motorhome for resigning from the Supreme Court. They'll give him a private jet. They'll give him whatever it takes. Clarence Thomas will live the life of an ultra-rich man for the rest of his life, the life he's always wanted to live, the rich man's life. And then there's 74-year-old Samuel Alito, who would be similarly convinced with similar financial inducements to leave the Supreme Court so that he, too, could be replaced by a 40-year-old Republican right-wing extremist who would extend the Trump court's rule another 40 years. Yes, your vote means possibly 40 more years control of the Supreme Court. Samuel Alito's wife would then be free after her husband left the court to yell anything she wants at her neighbors, but she might then be rich enough to live in a gated community that would lock her off from any exposure to anyone other than extremist Trump Republicans who share Mrs. Alito's views of flags, including her publicly expressed utter hatred of gay pride flags. That is a very easy two-judge deal for Donald Trump and rich Republicans to execute. At the event on Saturday, President Obama said this.
The power of the Supreme Court is determined by appointments. It is determined by elections. And so, what we're seeing now is a byproduct of, in 2016, there were a whole bunch of folks who, for whatever reason, sat out. They said, well, we're not enthusiastic enough. We're not feeling inspired enough. Why bother? And hopefully we have learned our lesson, because these elections matter in very concrete ways, and we're now seeing how much it matters when it comes to the Supreme Court.
Not inspired enough. One of the conditions that the Biden-Harris campaign knows they are facing is some degree of what President Obama was just talking about, some degree of voter apathy, which actually exists because Joe Biden has brought sanity back to the presidency. Some voters don't apparently remember how bad it was under the Trump presidency. And because of the normalcy of the Biden presidency, some of those voters have not had much reason to pay much attention to the actual accomplishments of the Biden presidency. When President Obama gets out on the campaign trail, this is what those voters will be hearing from him.
I've talked about this before. At its best, the presidency is a relay race, right? You take the baton and you run the race, and so we get the Affordable Care Act started. But we knew at the time that even though 20 million people were getting health insurance from it who didn't have it before, there were still some people who were having trouble affording it because we couldn't fund all the subsidies that a lot of people needed. Joe comes in, boosts some of the subsidies. That means millions more people are able to access health care that's affordable, and they can have some security. On climate change, we fund clean energy at record levels. When we first came into office, Joe and I together, we move forward in terms of making sure that fuel efficiency standards on cars have changed. We get the Paris Accords done. But that's not enough to deal with the size and scope of the challenges that we face. Joe comes in, makes historic investments in clean energy. So I take great pride in what the Biden administration has accomplished, and it's a reminder that we don't have to just vote against something in this election. We have somebody to worry about, and there's a whole agenda that we should be concerned about. But we can take pride in affirming the extraordinary work that Joe has done, and we want to make sure that we build on that and then pass it on to the next president, rather than have a president who wants to reverse the progress that has been made.